I exposed her cheating during the IPO opening. I gathered all the evidence, filed for divorce, and left her with nothing. She left letters that I no longer answered. When I met Meredith, she was the kind of woman who could command a room without saying a word. At 34, she had already built a name for herself as one of the brightest minds in the tech startup world. Sharp, ambitious, and impossibly driven, she was a force of nature. I was just a few years older, a financial analyst whose world revolved around numbers and spreadsheets, but she made me feel like I could be more, like I could stand beside her in her whirlwind of success. We married within a year of meeting, and for a while, life felt like a fairy tale. We bought a modern house in Palo Alto, surrounded by towering redwoods, and welcomed our son, Ethan, 2 years later. He was our anchor in a world that often felt too fast-paced to grasp. I adjusted my hours to be more present for him, ensuring that he always had at least one parent who wasn't consumed by work. Meredith, however, was unstoppable. By her early 40s, she was the CEO of her own tech startup, poised to take the industry by storm. Her company was days away from its biggest milestone yet, a high-stakes IPO that could redefine her legacy. She poured everything into it, often working late into the night, her laptop glowing in the darkness of our bedroom while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Our marriage began to shift under the weight of her ambitions. Meredith's focus on the company became all-encompassing, leaving little room for anything else. Dinners turned into quick bites at her desk. Weekends were spent on calls with investors. Intimacy dwindled into polite nods and fleeting kisses. I told myself it was temporary, that once the IPO was over, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I feared that this version of us might be permanent. It wasn't that I resented her success. On the contrary, I admired it. But as I watched her climb higher, I felt myself slipping further from her reach. And then one day he arrived, a new intern at her company, eager and full of youthful energy, a presence that would change everything. The first time I noticed something was off, it was subtle, almost too subtle to register. Meredith began mentioning him in passing, the new intern, Owen. It was always professional at first. Owen came up with a great idea during the meeting today, or Owen really seems to understand the vision for the product. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, interns came and went at her company like clockwork, eager young minds looking to make their mark in Silicon Valley. But Owen's name began to crop up more frequently, his contributions seemingly outweighing those of her seasoned team. It wasn't just the mentions that caught my attention. It was the way her face softened when she spoke about him. There was a spark in her eyes, a liveliness that I hadn't seen in a while. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Meredith had always been passionate about her work, and this was just another example of her investing in the potential of a promising mentee. But then there were the late nights. They had always been a part of her routine, especially with the IPO looming, but they began to stretch longer. She started coming home well past midnight, claiming meetings had run over or that she'd lost track of time while finalizing documents. Her phone, once a shared tool we left on the kitchen counter, became her constant companion. She'd glance at it during dinner, a faint smile tugging at her lips as messages popped up on the screen. When I asked about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just work, always work. I started to feel a gnawing unease, an instinct I couldn't shake. It wasn't that Meredith was acting openly suspicious. It was the accumulation of small things, the whispers of change in our life together. One night, as she worked in her office, I found myself pacing the living room, Ethan's toys scattered around my feet. The house felt empty despite her presence upstairs, the silence between us stretching farther than the physical distance. One evening, I decided to stop by her office unannounced. I'd been working late myself and thought I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout. When I arrived, the building was nearly deserted, the hum of fluorescent lights casting long shadows in the hallways. As I approached her office, I heard voices. Meredith's laughter carried through the partially open door, followed by a man's. Owen's, I assumed. I froze, my hand tightening around the paper bag of food. They were talking about something lighthearted, some inside joke I didn't understand. Her laugh was unrestrained, genuine. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in months, maybe longer. My chest tightened, and I stepped back before they could notice me. I left the building without saying a word, the food still warm in my hand. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed their voices in my mind, the ease and familiarity between them. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but the doubt had taken root. It grew over the following weeks, fed by Meredith's increasingly erratic behavior. She became more secretive, her explanations for her absences growing thinner. When I tried to bring it up, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, her focus always elsewhere. Then came the gala. It was a high-profile event, a celebration of the upcoming IPO, and Meredith insisted I come along. "It'll be good for you to see what we've been working so hard on," she said, her tone almost pleading. I agreed, hoping the night would help bridge the growing gap between us. The venue was grand, a sprawling ballroom filled with tech entrepreneurs, investors, and journalists. Meredith was in her element, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing me to people whose names I'd forget moments later. And then I met him, Owen. He was younger than I'd imagined, barely in his mid-20s, with an easy charm and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He greeted me warmly, his handshake firm, his smile disarming. Throughout the evening, I couldn't help but notice how often Meredith gravitated toward him. They shared quiet conversations, their heads close together as the room buzzed around them. I watched from a distance, a bitter taste in my mouth as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it admiration? Friendship? Or something more? After the gala, I confronted her. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "What's going on between you and Owen?" I asked as we sat in the car, the city lights blurring past us. Her reaction was immediate, defensive. "Nothing. He's an intern, for God's sake." "Why would you even ask that?" "Because you've been different," I said, my voice trembling. "You're distant, distracted. You laugh with him in a way you haven't with me in years." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's just work. The pressure, the stress, you have no idea what it's like right now. I'm trying to hold everything together, and you're accusing me of what, exactly?" I wanted to believe her, to take her words at face value. But the doubt remained, festering in the corners of my mind. I didn't push further that night, but the distance between us only grew. She spent more nights at the office, and when she was home, she was physically present but emotionally absent. Even Ethan noticed, asking me one evening, "Why doesn't Mommy play with me anymore?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I could do was hug him tightly and promise that everything would be okay, even as my own faith in that promise wavered. The final straw came on a Sunday morning. Meredith had left early, claiming she needed to prepare for a crucial meeting. After she left, I found her tablet on the kitchen counter, its screen still glowing. I hadn't intended to invade her privacy, but as I reached to turn it off, a message notification caught my eye. It was from Owen. The preview read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." The room spun as I stared at the screen, the weight of the words crashing down on me. I opened the message thread, my hands shaking. The conversation was unmistakably intimate, filled with inside jokes, plans, and confessions that left no room for doubt. In that moment, everything changed. The woman I thought I knew, the life we had built together, felt like a lie. I put the tablet down and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sunlight streaming through the window. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, numb, as the reality of her betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I knew then that there was no going back. The question was no longer whether something was happening between them. It was what I was going to do about it. The discovery left me hollow. I moved through the days like a man outside his own life, watching from a distance as the pieces of my marriage crumbled around me. Meredith continued her routine, unaware that the facade she had so carefully constructed had shattered in my mind. I'd see her in the mornings, perfectly composed as she left for work, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. At night, she'd slip into bed hours after I'd turned out the lights, her presence as cold and distant as the empty side of the mattress. I began to notice things I hadn't paid attention to before. Her wardrobe had subtly shifted. The practical, understated outfits she used to favor were replaced by pieces that accentuated her figure. There were new shoes in the closet, ones I had never seen her wear at home. Her makeup routine became more meticulous, her appearance polished to perfection even on days she claimed to have no meetings. She spent more time at the office than ever. On the night she didn't come home until late, I'd sit in the living room with the lights off, staring at the glow of her tablet on the coffee table. I couldn't bring myself to look at it again, though I didn't need to. The message from Owen was seared into my memory, a brand I couldn't erase. The words repeated in my mind like a taunt. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Ethan's questions became harder to answer. He'd ask why Meredith wasn't home for dinner or why she couldn't make it to his soccer game. I'd tell him she was working, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't understand. How could he? I didn't understand it myself. I'd sit with him as he played with his toys, his small hands arranging blocks into towers, and wonder how much longer I could keep the truth from him. It wasn't just Ethan who noticed. Friends began to ask subtle questions, their concern wrapped in polite conversation. At a barbecue, a close friend of ours pulled me aside and asked if everything was all right. I forced a smile and assured him it was just the stress of the IPO, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The cracks in our marriage were visible to everyone except Meredith, who seemed oblivious to the tension growing around her. One Saturday, while she was at yet another meeting, I decided to drive to her office. I had no plan, no clear idea of what I hoped to achieve, but the urge to do something, anything, was too strong to resist. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. Her car was there, parked in its usual spot. Beside it was another car I didn't recognize, a sleek black sedan that stood out among the more practical vehicles of her coworkers. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, the seconds dragging as I stared at the building. The lights on the top floor were on, the faint silhouette of movement visible through the blinds. I imagined her there with him, their laughter echoing through the empty halls, their shared glances a secret language I wasn't meant to understand. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I waited. When the lights finally went out, my heart began to race. I watched as the front door opened, and they emerged, their figures illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. Meredith's head tilted back as she laughed at something Owen said, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture so casual, yet so intimate that it twisted something deep inside me. They walked to their cars together, their conversation unhurried. Owen opened the door for her, a gesture I'd once prided myself on but hadn't done in years. She paused before getting in, her face turned toward him as she said something I couldn't hear. He smiled, leaning closer, and for a moment, I thought he might kiss her. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, and they parted ways, their cars disappearing into the night. I drove home in silence, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me like a physical force. The house was dark when I arrived, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty table where we used to share meals, and felt a wave of anger rise within me. It wasn't just her betrayal that hurt. It was the way she had so easily cast aside everything we'd built together. The life we'd created, the family we'd promised to nurture, all of it reduced to an afterthought in the face of her ambition and desire. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her yet. Not until I was certain of what I wanted to say, of what I wanted to do. The truth was out, but the next move was mine. For now, I'd wait. I'd watch. And when the time came, I'd make sure she understood the full weight of what she'd done. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. I had seen enough to know the truth, but knowing wasn't enough. The betrayal gnawed at me, a relentless ache that wouldn't let go. Meredith carried on as though nothing had changed, her routine perfectly calibrated to maintain appearances. I watched her closely, every gesture, every movement dissected in my mind. She had become a stranger in our home, a stranger with secrets that I could no longer ignore. I began to document everything. It wasn't enough to feel the weight of her betrayal. I needed proof, something tangible to ground the storm of emotions inside me. I retrieved the messages from her tablet, saving screenshots of her conversations with Owen. I installed a discreet tracking app on her phone, one that allowed me to see her location in real time. It felt invasive, even cruel, but the rational part of me justified it. She had broken the trust first. Her patterns were predictable. The late nights at the office, the fabricated meetings, the weekends spent preparing for the IPO. Each time, her location lined up with Owen's. They frequented a small boutique hotel on the outskirts of Palo Alto, a place just discreet enough to keep their secret hidden. I'd park my car across the street, the dashboard camera recording every arrival and departure. Meredith's car would pull in, followed minutes later by Owen's. They'd disappear inside for hours, emerging only when the shadows grew long and the night demanded their return to normalcy. Back home, I maintained a facade of ignorance. I went through the motions, helping Ethan with his homework, cooking dinner, pretending not to notice Meredith's carefully crafted excuses. She'd kiss Ethan on the forehead, telling him she was proud of him, her voice warm and maternal. It was the same voice she used with me, one that made me question whether she felt any guilt at all. Did she even realize how deeply her actions had cut? Or was she so consumed by her own desires that the consequences were invisible to her? One evening, after she left for another meeting, I sat in Ethan's room, watching him build a spaceship out of Legos. He chattered happily about school, his voice full of excitement as he described a project he was working on with his friends. I forced myself to smile, to engage with him, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop picturing Meredith and Owen, their stolen moments, their laughter. I wondered if she ever thought about Ethan during those times, if she felt even a flicker of shame. The evidence I collected began to pile up. I compiled it meticulously, organizing photos, messages, and location logs into a folder on my laptop. It was a grim project, one that felt more like an autopsy of our marriage than a collection of facts. Each new piece of evidence deepened the wound, but I couldn't stop. I needed it all. I needed to understand the extent of her betrayal, even if it destroyed me in the process. Then came the night I couldn't ignore anymore. Meredith had left early that morning, her bag packed with documents she claimed were crucial for a client presentation. She kissed Ethan goodbye, promising she'd be home in time to tuck him in. I didn't believe her. The tracking app showed her location at the same boutique hotel, and I knew she wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. I made arrangements for Ethan to stay with my sister that evening. He was thrilled at the prospect of a sleepover with his cousins, his joy a small comfort in the chaos of my thoughts. Once he was settled, I drove to the hotel, my mind racing with what I might do when I arrived. Confrontation felt inevitable, but I didn't know if I was ready for it. The parking lot was quiet when I arrived, the air heavy with the stillness of the evening. Meredith's car was there, parked in its usual spot. Owen's car was next to it, their proximity almost mocking. I parked a few spaces away and sat in my car, staring at the entrance to the hotel. The dashboard camera recorded the scene, capturing the damning evidence I already knew existed. I couldn't sit idle any longer. The anger that had simmered inside me for weeks boiled over, propelling me out of the car and toward the entrance. The lobby was small and sparsely decorated, the receptionist barely glancing up as I walked past. My heart pounded in my chest as I climbed the stairs, each step bringing me closer to the confrontation I had been avoiding. Their room was on the second floor. I found it easily, the door slightly ajar as if left carelessly unattended. I stood outside for a moment, the sound of muffled laughter reaching me from inside. It was Meredith's laugh, light and carefree, a sound I hadn't heard in months. My fists clenched at my sides as I pushed the door open. The scene inside was exactly what I had imagined, and yet worse than I could have prepared for. Meredith and Owen sat on the edge of the bed, their laughter dying the moment they saw me. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. Owen stood quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to something resembling fear. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was deafening, the weight of the moment crushing. I didn't yell. I didn't lash out. Instead, I held up my phone, showing them the screen. It displayed the photos, the messages, the locations. Everything. Meredith's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Owen took a step back, his confidence evaporating in the face of the evidence. Without a word, I turned and walked out. The sound of Meredith calling my name followed me down the hallway, but I didn't stop. The air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the hotel room. I got into my car and drove away, the weight of what I had just done settling over me like a heavy blanket. Back home, the house was silent. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of evidence on my laptop. The confrontation hadn't brought the closure I had hoped for. If anything, it had only deepened the void. I thought about Ethan, about the life we had built together, and wondered how I would explain this to him. How do you tell a child that the foundation of their world has been torn apart? In the days that followed, Meredith tried to reach out. She left messages, emails, even a handwritten letter on the kitchen counter. I didn't read them. Her words felt meaningless now, empty attempts to justify the unjustifiable. I focused on Ethan, on keeping his life as stable as possible in the midst of the storm. But stability felt like an illusion. Every time I saw her, every time her name appeared on my phone, the anger and hurt resurfaced. I couldn't escape it, couldn't find a way to move forward. The evidence was there, undeniable and damning. But the question of what to do next loomed over me like a shadow. The confrontation had been only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The days after my confrontation with Meredith felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath me crumbling with each passing moment. She stayed away for the first few nights, presumably with Owen, though I refused to check the tracker anymore. I didn't need more reminders of her betrayal. My focus now was on Ethan, shielding him from the fallout of a situation he didn't deserve to be caught in. Ethan's questions became harder to answer. "When is Mommy coming home?" he asked one evening as we played a board game at the kitchen table. I told him she was busy with work, the lie burning on my tongue. His innocent face made the weight of my decisions even heavier. How could I dismantle his world by telling him the truth? How could I let him grow up believing in something so fragile? But avoidance was no longer an option. Meredith's attempts to reach out grew more desperate. She called, texted, even showed up at the house unannounced, pleading for a chance to explain. I didn't let her in. Through the door, I told her to leave, my voice cold and unrecognizable even to myself. Her protests echoed in the hallway, but I didn't falter. My resolve, however, wasn't unshakable. Late at night, I'd sit in the living room, staring at the photos and messages I'd collected. The anger and hurt would churn inside me, threatening to overwhelm my composure. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Something had to give, and it did. A meeting with my lawyer laid the groundwork for the next steps. The divorce papers were drafted swiftly, the evidence I had meticulously collected leaving little room for negotiation. My lawyer assured me that the documentation would protect me and Ethan, ensuring we had what we needed to move forward. It felt clinical, detached, but I clung to the process as a lifeline. The day I handed Meredith the papers was quiet and devastating. She showed up at the house, her expression weary, as though she hadn't slept in days. I didn't invite her in. Instead, I stepped onto the porch and handed her the envelope. She looked down at it, her hands trembling slightly before meeting my gaze. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but the silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The following weeks were a blur of logistics and adjustments. Meredith moved out of the house, taking only what she needed. The empty spaces she left behind, her clothes in the closet, her books on the shelves, felt like wounds that wouldn't heal. I found myself filling the silence with noise, music, television, anything to drown out the echoes of what used to be. Ethan adapted better than I expected. Children, I realized, are resilient in ways adults often aren't. He asked fewer questions as time went on, accepting the new reality with the simplicity of youth. I made every effort to keep his life stable, attending his soccer games, helping with his school projects, and tucking him in each night with a promise that I would always be there for him. Meredith's presence in his life became structured and supervised. She saw him on weekends, their time together monitored by agreements laid out in the divorce settlement. I didn't ask what they talked about or how she explained our separation to him. It wasn't my place, and I didn't want to know. For myself, healing was slower, more complicated. The anger that had fueled me through the confrontation and the divorce faded, leaving behind an emptiness I couldn't ignore. I took up running, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the chaos in my mind. Each mile I ran felt like a step away from the pain, a step toward reclaiming the person I had been before Meredith and Owen. One evening, as I sorted through old photos, I found a picture of our family from a vacation we had taken years ago. Meredith's smile was wide and genuine, her arms wrapped around Ethan and me. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of what we had lost pressing down on me. But instead of bitterness, I felt a strange sense of acceptance. The love we had shared had been real, even if it hadn't lasted. And while I couldn't forgive her, I could choose not to let her actions define the rest of my life. Months turned into a year, and the life Ethan and I built together began to feel whole again. The house, once a place filled with painful memories, became a sanctuary. Ethan's laughter filled the rooms, and I found joy in the small moments. Cooking breakfast together, cheering him on at his games, reading him stories before bed. Meredith faded further into the background of our lives. She continued her career, her company recovering from the scandal of her affair with Owen. I didn't follow the details closely, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that Owen had left the company not long after everything came to light. Their relationship, it seemed, hadn't survived the fallout. For me, the future felt uncertain but hopeful. I learned to let go of the anger, to focus on what truly mattered. Ethan was thriving, and I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been lost in the shadow of my marriage. The pain of betrayal would never fully disappear, but it had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who knew the value of trust and the importance of protecting the people who matter most. As I stood in the doorway of Ethan's room one evening, watching him sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Life had changed irrevocably, but it had also moved forward. And for the first time, I was ready to embrace it.